Individual Thoughts by Trusted Knower.
Episode 003, Between the Darkness and the Light.
We are gray. We stand between the darkness and the light.
How much more is there to learn, Delenn? They are a primitive people.
What is it that makes the humans so special? What is it that draws you to them?
They fight. They argue. They are ruled by passions and fears.
Yes, and that is their strength. They do not seek conformity. They do not surrender. Out of their differences comes symmetry, their unique capacity to fight against impossible odds. Hurt them, and they only come back stronger. The passions we deplore have taken them to their place in the stars and will propel them to a great destiny. They carry within them the capacity to walk among the stars like giants. They are the future, and we have much to learn from them.
Hey man, how's it going?
Hey Kevin, what's up, man?
Hey, it's episode 003.
It is episode 003. How time flies.
What are we calling this episode?
We are calling this episode Between the Darkness and the Light.
What does it mean to you, Bernard?
I guess it could mean that humanity is somewhere between the darkness and the light.
So, what do you think about what Delenn said about humanity? Is she right?
Some of it, sure, but not all of it.
What's your biggest disagreement?
Biggest disagreement is this whole, they don't seek conformity.
Wrong! It's not true of everybody, but it is true of some.
It's a generalization I think is overall false because no, from history through now, I'd say in general, the overwhelming majority of humans seek conformity. However, she was talking about the tiny little fraction of small percentage of people who don't seek conformity.
I believe that what Delenn is saying and what her mission is, and we'll get into this in the cover story at length about in the story of Babylon 5, what her role is. But I believe that she is a person who is standing between the darkness and the light. And the idea of that is that there's enormous lack of knowledge out there in the world. There's an enormous amount of ignorance and stupidity. And the truth is hard to hear, as the Indigo Girls would say. And even the people who are fighting cannot always see the truth. And so Between the Darkness and the Light is about the people who are aware of the darkness and they are engaging the darkness, but they're trying to perceive the light. And that's why they are between the darkness and the light. And I think that exactly speaks to the mission of Trusted Knower. I want to give people a preview of our hour-long episode that we have here. And the clip we're going to show you in a second here has a critical piece of information that people need to understand. And that's why we're putting it right up front so that you can hear it right now. It's about American democracy and what we need to do to make American democracy work. And that's what this next clip is about.
How should government be set up? And we lose sight of the fact that the people, the whole key to representative democracy, to our representative republic, is representation. And we don't get it. And it's been the greatest problem we have. This is about big money and this is about power. And what we need are people in office who are actually representing us. And that's not easy. But term limits are a great thing. So are much smaller districts where we actually know. I'd like to see, instead of 700,000 plus people in a congressional district, I'd like to see more like 50,000.
I agree with that. I totally agree with that.
It's a whole different Congress.
I thought we should move this particular clip to the front of the episode because what Paul is saying about the representation of the American people in the Congress is so fundamental. If we're going to have this idea of representative government, which is the concept of the United States itself, through democratic practices, we elect our representatives to the Congress. But if you're representing so many people, really you're not representing very many of them at all. Most of those people are basically not represented because they're just too far away from the government. They're too far away from the congressman. And the idea of becoming more like the New Hampshire House, where we have, maybe it's a much bigger body and maybe they can't all meet in the Capitol in DC, but even one congressman for 50,000 people is like a mayor of a medium size or a small city, like the city of Asheville, for instance. Even though, the mayor may not like you very much, you may not like the mayor very much, you actually can go and talk to the mayor. And so this goes back to this idea of the darkness and the light. The darkness is all of those people whose voices are being ignored. And the light is having the government policy be informed by what people actually know and believe, in the sense that we're looking for a representative government. We need to improve it in some huge way. And this is maybe the most critical and crucial path to doing so. So we put that out there. And the interview goes into a lot of other things also about national security. It goes into the desire of the rulers to not be interfered with by, the riffraff of the public, and these kind of tensions between authority and democracy and freedom and authority. And it's not to say we shouldn't have authority. It's good to have smart people who are in the government and they are there for a long time and they know how things work, and that we need those people. But they shouldn't be controlling us. Elected representatives should be able to change what the government is based upon feedback from the people. And if we can't have that, we really can't call ourselves a free society. I also want to say one more thing real fast before we get into Paul's interview. We were talking a minute ago about Mira Furlan, and she plays Delenn in that clip at the very beginning of this episode. We're going to say a lot more about Mira Furlan and her character Delenn in the cover story. And some may know that sadly Mira Furlan passed in the beginning of this year. It's a very sad loss, and her life is quite interesting the more you read about it. She actually basically was driven out of Yugoslavia right before the Bosnian War, and basically the same ethnic tensions that caused that war was what caused her to have to flee. I was kind of joking that she was canceled by the people of Yugoslavia. And she's a lovely person, and we may not agree with her personal politics or whatever, but she's a good person basically as a human being. And I think when she played Delenn, she's bringing into that character all the grief and the anguish of seeing your own country destroyed basically. And so she's probably watching on the TV as her people she knows are in danger as the country fell apart. And so everything we're talking about in terms of this episode, in terms of what Paul is talking about, are ideas about how to avoid that terrible kind of outcome from happening. And it's like, this is why we make this podcast. It's not because we just enjoy hearing ourselves talk. It's about trying to help people see a way of talking to each other, to talk ourselves through this problem so we don't end up in that situation. And so I feel like America is between the darkness and the light. And we may be plunging into darkness if we don't figure this stuff out now.
And from my perspective, even if it's too late, we should at least document the ways of how to do it if we have that opportunity again. So I think it's worthy of, regardless of anything and how we feel, because I have personally very, different opinions as to where we are and what's going to be happening than probably most everyone we're going to be interviewing. However, I do agree with the idea of at least documenting how it should be. And I think that is worthwhile. So, hey, I guess we should continue the rest of the show, huh?
Let's do it. So, hey, Bernard.
Hey, Kevin.
We got a great guest for episode 3 today.
Yay!
And our good old friend, Paul Jacob of the Liberty Initiative Fund. Hey, Paul.
Hey, how's it going, guys? Good to see you.
Yeah, I've known Paul for a little bit over 20 years. Remember when you were facing trial in Oklahoma for some ballot access petitioning that you were doing for a taxpayer Bill of Rights?
Yes, they decided they kind of swerved outside some of the constitutional lines, I think, to block that initiative, which basically is the Taxpayer Bill of Rights that's in force in Colorado. Great idea. Government can only grow by inflation plus population growth, unless there's a reason to grow more, and then they simply ask the people to be able to spend additional money or to raise additional taxes. And off you go. So it puts the public in charge. People don't like that idea.
Strangely,
the Democrats that like democracy don't like democracy on that one particular item, which is the purse strings. But anyway, I digress. Well, they blocked it from getting on the ballot, even though I think we had more than enough signatures. And they basically threw out signatures from people who were still living in Oklahoma a year after the petition drive, saying they were not residents. And residency is a rule that used to be in a lot of states. It's been struck down almost everywhere now. But it basically says you have to live in this city or in this state in order to collect signatures on a petition. And, you know, if you think about the Freedom Riders going down to Mississippi in the early 60s, it was kind of the same argument. Hey, you're outside agitators. You're just down here to cause trouble. We don't need you outsiders. And frankly, that attitude is alive and well, maybe not with a racial component, although our petition drive in Maine, we had more than their share of problems with some of the Black petitioners who came up to work. And you know, lots of places that everything went swimmingly, but a few of the police departments didn't seem to think they should be on the street. So, you know, anyway, with all of this, in Oklahoma, they came after three of us saying that we had conspired to defraud the state by using petition circulators who were not residents. And we, of course, you know, I was not running the day-to-day affairs. I was an advisor on the campaign. They came after me because I was connected to people who wrote checks, and they wanted to try to threaten those people. And anyway, after a year and a half of being under a felony indictment, 10 years in prison in Oklahoma, 10 years in prison is pretty bad. I figure the state prisons in Oklahoma is no better. But anyway, I'm little levity there. And after a year and a half, they simply dropped without ever getting through even a preliminary hearing. They dropped all the charges, and they dropped them because they had no case. But it just showed me, I think it showed a lot of people just how outrageous they can be in terms of coming down on people that, you know, they had no evidence that we did anything other than follow the rules as they told them to us. And so it was just a travesty, but it demonstrated to me how afraid they are of the power of citizens actually getting engaged. There's a dirty little secret in America, and it's that democracy is just lip service. Most people in politics, working as politicians, as staffers, as other activists, they want their side to win by hook or by crook. They don't give a damn about democracy.
Once you create genuinely democratic local communities, it won't stop there. Once they get established, they'll insist on more power. If you have regional government, they decide it all in Nottingham.
It is their city.
And what happens to us?
Well, much less work.
Yes, much less work. So little that ministers might almost be able to do it on their own. So we'd have much less power.
Well, I don't know whether I really want power.
Bernard, if the right people don't have power, do you know what happens? The wrong people get it. Politicians, councillors, ordinary voters.
But aren't they supposed to in a democracy?
This is a British democracy.
How do you mean?
British democracy recognizes that you need a system to protect the important things of life and keep them out of the hands of the barbarians.
And I think maybe it's because we're libertarians and we're used to losing. So losing an election, you know, we don't smash all the toys in our room and cry, and, you know, but for whatever reason, we can kind of accept that you just don't always win. And it seems to me that, you know, if three of us are going to a movie, we're gonna discuss, and we're gonna try to be sensitive to the minority position, but it's probably going to be a Democratic vote and trying to get consensus. And if we had more people, it'd probably be less consensus and more of a Democratic vote if we all want to go together somewhere. Democracy is not some crazy thing. Now, it's also not perfect. It doesn't mean that if you vote on it, you get to steal people's stuff or beat them up or put them in concentration camps or anything else. But it is just flooring that there is so much phony BS talk about democracy, that the Washington Post changes their masthead to democracy dies in darkness. And yet we live in a time in which it's a-okay for big tech companies to shut people down and cancel their voice. It is okay for the media to support amendments to our Constitution that would strip out the First Amendment freedom of speech for political speech, my freedom of speech. And that's the amendment that was in 2016. Every Democratic senator supported it. The New York Times supports it, the Washington Post. It so gives Congress the power to regulate campaigns and regulate political speech and money and everything involved in it, that they felt it necessary to write in one of the provisions that it did not abridge freedom of the press. So in essence, we're willing to keep freedom of the press, but we're getting rid of freedom of speech. Nobody knows this. Nobody talks about it except for me, and I'm kind of the broken record guy who's talking, what's he talking about? But we live in a society in which the media hides information from us purposely so that we don't vote incorrectly. That by itself is just a game changer. And not that they haven't done it in the past, but just it is done as a religious act today. And we've got big tech shutting people down. And it just seems to me that at the core, the more we can use basic democratic principles, basic small r Republican principles, term limits, limits on government, all the two issues that are the biggest issues in having the right and the left upset. Let's say the left is upset about criminal justice issues. Truth is, so is the center and the right. But let's just say that's the left. Well, let's go address them. The country will love it. Let's go address them. And why hasn't it been addressed? I mean, Trump got something through. There's so much more that could be done. The public is screaming for it, and not just on the left, on the right, and in the middle. Why does nothing get done? I think we're going to have to do it. The other issue on the right is election integrity. We voted for 6 weeks in Virginia. For 6 weeks we voted. That's insane. That means two things, and then I'll shut up. It means, one, that we don't vote in the same election, really. If you voted 6 weeks before the end, you didn't hear the New York Post story about Hunter Biden. Oh, actually, you may not have heard that anyway, because they wanted to cover that story up. But so that's a problem. The other problem is it's a huge advantage to moneyed incumbents. And incumbents, what's the main thing about incumbents? Well, there's name ID, there's the franking privilege, there's all kinds of other advantages, like a vote right now on how to spend a ton of money. But there's also the big financial advantage. And so they can spend money for 6 weeks on the airwaves, whereas a challenger may be lucky to spend enough that in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, they can be up on the airwaves. So, anyway, there's a lot of problems out there. The solution is us using basic tools of democracy, I think, because that's what our overseers want least. They do not want grassroots people involved. They want us all as spectators.
That you're somebody who has a tremendous amount of brass tacks on the ground kind of knowledge about how all these political systems interoperate, and a lot of what you're doing is using that knowledge to push forward. Your project is called Liberty Initiative Fund, and helping people on the ground actually create opportunities to hold the government accountable. Can you talk a little bit more about how you help people do that?
Yes. I'm always talking about, you should do an initiative. A referendum is when you take something that the legislature has done or the city council and you put that to a vote. That's a little tougher because you always have to have the right timing. It's usually a 60-day or 90-day period. So you have to be very quick, and that's not always doable for grassroots groups. If you have money, then it's more expensive because it's a short time, but people don't always have money. the initiative at the local or state level is, and I'd love to see a component of it at the federal level, but there's none there. But that is something where you come up with your own law. You have a way to build a better mousetrap. In most of the cities and counties in this country, there is an initiative process where you can put your law down, write it down, get legal help. And that's kind of how we help, Kevin, is we're going to say, what do you want to do? Has anyone drafted it in legal form? We can send it to different legal minds around the country who might have a sense of it and might have broader experience. So I think Liberty Initiative Fund can be very, very helpful to people who want to do an initiative, because we're going to bring experience from around the country and a lot more experience than the average person who says, hey, I want to do something, and has the wherewithal to launch a campaign. Usually at the local level, sometimes the signature requirements are not huge. And so, that makes it a little more doable. Whereas at the state level, a lot of times you're talking in Maine, you need 85,000 signatures to qualify something for the ballot. But we're going to help on the legal aspect of it. We're going to help on how to build a coalition, get other people involved, how to collect the signatures through volunteers as much as possible, but also helping to raise money and hire signature gatherers. There's kind of this underlying sense, it comes more from the left, I think, but that the initiative process, it's not right that you pay people to go gather signatures. Everyone should do this in their free time. And of course, if we lived in the 1950s, when, most families had one person at home all the time, and there was just a lot more free time, a lot less people looking at their phone, maybe you could do more of that. But the interesting thing is that, like, the restrictions in Maine were designed to block professional circulators from coming in there. You had to be a registered voter in Maine and had to be a resident, obviously, to be a registered voter. And what that's designed to do is just to block the number of people who can carry a petition and carry the message. And this was a citizen-only voting measure that's been controversial in the state. Portland's tried to have non-citizens voting. That got blocked in a referendum, but there's been a lot of agitation on that. And the powers that be never like the initiative, because of the whole purpose of the initiative is to do something the powers that be won't do themselves and probably don't want anyone else to do. And so it's a wonderful check. I came across it because of term limits. Well, there's no way you're going to get term limits on a body. I mean, it's possible, it's happened before, but it ain't easy to get term limits by getting politicians to vote among themselves. You need that check of a citizen initiative where you can get around the conflict of interest they have. And we help with all parts of it. Sometimes we come up with ideas that we try to sell people on at the local or state level around the country. Other times we see a good idea and say, how can we help? And then, whisper in somebody's ear a few states over that maybe this is a good idea.
You mentioned U.S. term limits, and you were the founder and president of U.S. term limits starting in 1992. Is that right?
Well, in 1992, U.S. term limits came on the scene. I wasn't the founder. I was the first employee. I was working at a group called Citizens for Congressional Reform, and there were some changes going on with them. And basically, Howie Rich came on the scene, who I knew from running libertarian ballot drives. And he knew that the main thing was going to be running ballot drives and putting this on the ballot. And so I wasn't a bad guy to bump into. And we worked together. And still talk. I'm on the board still of U.S. term limits. I don't work for them anymore, but sometimes I feel like I still do. But that's Howie's influence. Anyway, it was something where we realized, put this on the ballot for people everywhere you possibly can. We ran ourselves ragged on so many state ballots, so many local ballots, and literally won almost everywhere. Every once in a while, someone would try to do a gotcha with a term limit where they're going after the mayor, but not the city council or something. And voters would almost always nix those kind of stupid moves. But voters love this concept. And there are other, to me, term limits was nice because everyone, I think, when they're thinking about term limits is at their most libertarian, kind of at their core, how should government be set up? And we lose sight of the fact that the whole key to representative democracy, to our representative republic, is representation, and we don't get it. And it's been the greatest problem we have is that the president sometimes people feel like is doing a good job. The courts, I think, aren't great always, but I think are functioning somewhat, the federal courts at least, as the framers might have wanted them to. But the Congress is a mess, and none of us feel represented, and we're not. And the districts are so gigantic that you need a ton of money and connections to get in the game. And I always point people to the New Hampshire legislature. 400 House members in New Hampshire. The average district is 3,000 people. Now, you can have billions of dollars to spend in New Hampshire House elections, and you might, if you don't have a message, you won't make a dent because they know the people they're electing. You can run nasty ads, against my wife all day, but I know her. I live with her. I like her, believe it or not. And so, it's a whole different kind of politics. And with all the focus on money and politics, and then of course, when you see some of the things happen, Hunter Biden's a good case in point. I mean, no matter whether you think there was something criminal or not criminal, what is Hunter Biden getting $1.5 billion from the Chinese? What is he doing with some energy company in Ukraine when he doesn't know anything about energy? We all know what this is about. This is about big money, and this is about power. And what we need are people in office who are actually representing us. And that's not easy, but term limits are a great thing. So are much smaller districts where we actually know. I'd like to see, instead of 700,000 plus people in a congressional district, I'd like to see more like 50,000.
I agree with that. I totally agree with that.
It's a whole different Congress. You might need a stadium somewhere, a small stadium for them to all get together. But, we're in a modern age with technology, and I would like them voting more from their districts. I'd like them more connected to us and less connected to Washington. And some people say, well, they won't have the camaraderie. Well, if you've seen the camaraderie, maybe that's an added advantage.
Since you're talking about the districting and how we've heard about gerrymandering for so long, and how both parties are so both guilty in this. North Carolina has some really strange districting around Charlotte and whatnot, where you can tell that the parties just carve out little sections. Have you ever heard of the idea of split line districting? And this is still out there on rangevoting.org. Let me share my screen real quick and see if you've seen this. Just to give you one example of graphic representation of what they put together, a couple states here. Indiana, the current method, or Indiana 2007, it was listed here on the left. And on the right, this is how it would turn out with what they call split line districting. Alabama, they had a great one for North Carolina. I don't know where it is. But it's designed in a way to where instead of allowing the parties to draw these lines, it's done more mathematically and scientifically. Have you ever heard of this sort of thing?
It rings a bell, but I don't know anything about it. But you can see from the pictures that it's more compact, and I think compactness is a value. You don't want the long squiggly lines and so on. I tend to favor multi-member districts, and that would get away from some of the problems, and it would also allow. It'd be nice to be in a district where maybe you're electing 3 representatives to Congress, or in a state where maybe you have only 1 or 2 or 3. Well, obviously, if you only have 1 congressman, you're electing them at large. But if you had 2 or 3 or 4, you might do the same thing and take the top 4 vote getters, which might give a little bit more representation. That if you're a libertarian, for instance, you're getting 2 or 3% of the vote. You got no representation currently. But if you got maybe in a state, I think in my former home state of Arkansas, you have 4 reps. Well, you're probably going to get, you may get 4 Republicans. That's what they've got now, I think. But you're going to get maybe different type Republicans, a couple of very conservative, maybe one more moderate, maybe one more libertarian. What we're looking for is ways to allow people's vote to get them representation. And that's why I think the biggest thing is the smaller districts, because that alone, just because I've seen it work in New Hampshire, Vermont, somewhat the same way. Their state legislatures are responsive in a way that I think you want the legislatures to be. And but I was on the board of Fair Vote for a long time. I like ranked choice voting. I like proportional representation. A lot of, I tend to be seen as more conservative because of term limits and so on. A lot of conservatives and even libertarians who don't like some of these voting methods. But I look at them like, try it on and see how it works. And then if that doesn't work, we could go to something else. I think there's a tendency to think that somehow, God reached his hand down and touched, not Peter or somebody, but Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to write the Constitution. I don't believe that. And they aren't sacred documents. They're smart documents, but we got to fix them where we can. But I do think the biggest issue is the size of that district. And what I like so much about that issue is not only does it affect the core representation, but all the peripheral stuff, the campaign finance, and for years, you argue with people. I like the First Amendment. I think people have a right to do with their money what they want to do with their money and to speak as vibrantly as they want. And if they have 50,000 times more money than I do, which a number of people in this world do, well, so be it. But let me spend my money. Something like the district size has such a game clearing, board clearing type impact on that. And yet, you don't hear the campaign finance people getting there. And I think it needs to be talked about more and more, because I think in the end, it's the honest, straightforward, free way to take a lot of the big money and outside influence out without ever denying anybody their voice.
It was about a year ago that you were in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Well, and I'll jump all the way back that one of the biggest political events in my life, I didn't know necessarily what to do with it exactly, but was Tiananmen Square in 1989. Some people have asked, where did the term limits movement come from? And I remember hearing a couple of Washington, D.C. scholar types say, well, it was slow economic growth or whatever. And I was thinking, I don't remember, 89, 90, 91, 92 being tremendously slow economic growth. Here's what I think it was. So I'm going to connect what we talk about in terms of term limits with Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square was Chinese people just rising up and saying, we want a voice. We want basic democracy. Some of them in interviews, if you go and look on YouTube, there's a ton of stuff, and elsewhere saying, we don't know all the ins and outs of democracy. We just know we want some voice. And so they knew what they had was, totalitarian-esque and getting more totalitarian all the time. That had a tremendous impact on me. I was working for the Libertarian Party then, talking to different state legislatures about ballot access and bringing up what happened in Tiananmen Square, what they did, what happened in Czechoslovakia and the wall coming down in Germany and Poland and so on, is that we not only saw the Cold War go away, so the devils that had been thrown up at us that we have to just keep our head down and fight the devils were gone. It seemed instantaneously. And at the same time, we saw broadcast back to us the goddess of liberty on Tiananmen Square in Beijing. We saw, Czechs pouring into the streets. We saw the courage of Lech Walesa without any army, without any guns, just with their unity and strength of character, holding, basically overthrowing the communist government in the end. And it was terribly inspiring. The terrible part maybe because then we took a look at, for the first time in decades, really the first time post World War II, we looked at City Hall and we looked at the Congress and the State House, and we were horrified that we had no control. And of course, we'd given away the control. Everything was top secret. Everything was fighting the communists. And so that's, I think, where the term limit movement came from. That was one of the most inspiring events in my lifetime. And about I was scheduled to go to this global forum on modern direct democracy in Taichung, Taiwan. And I got this ticket that flew through Hong Kong. And I remember my wife saying, "How'd you get this screwy ticket? What a terrible thing where you have this layover for 36 hours in Hong Kong." And I remember saying, "Honey, if you only knew how hard I worked to get that layover in Hong Kong." I wanted to join the march. I wanted to see what was happening. And I did join the march and the anti-totalitarianism march, and learned what I think the best term is for the Chinese communists, which is Chinazis. They're not really communists; they're fascists and they're totalitarians. But in that march, we were tear gassed and didn't seem, there was nothing happening. Nobody was pelting, police with anything. But also just got to stand with, and walk with a lot of people that I think what Snowden showed us years ago in disclosing what the NSA was up to, that they have all of our phone records. And I'm not so sure they don't have audio tapes of our phone calls, but even if they just have the record of every call you made, they've got our bank records. They've got all our social media. And some of this maybe you say, "Oh, I don't care." For the government to scoop up all the information, they had no authority to do it. And since they had no authority to do it then, who knows, they're not doing it now. They're literally eavesdropping on all foreign, Merkel's conversations in her office in Germany. That was just, and a lot of us suspected it, but here was the proof it was happening. The fact it took so long to do anything about it, the fact that it may still be going on, the fact that our leaders kind of want to be like the Chinese leaders, because in doing a thing on Tiananmen Square, this was in 2019, 30th anniversary, I started to look at, this was for my website, this is commonsense.org. And on the weekends, a lot of times we'll do videos. We started to do a podcast, so that kind of replaced it. But I was looking for videos about Tiananmen Square, and I watched a few and was just overcome with emotion of what these people did, of just the risks they were taking, and the first time that the troops came in to take over Tiananmen Square, they were pacified by the crowds of people who reached out to them as fellow human beings and said, "Don't do this."
Yeah.
And that should not be forgotten. A lot of times people think, China's a lot richer now. People's lives have been improved in terms of not freedom, but some of the other statistical categories. And I think sometimes people think, well, the government's probably pretty popular. But, Clubhouse, the app that just came out where people can discuss things and then was shut down in China. Well, they had a lot to say about their government, and it wasn't all rosy stuff about how much they love it. So I just have always kind of followed what happened there, been very moved by it. And then I'm going there and I'm tear gassed in Hong Kong and just very moved by being close to these people. Because I think the people in Hong Kong, these young people, mostly, some older people, they're not dumb. They know they're fighting a 8,000-pound monster with their bare hands. They know how tough it is what they're trying to do. And I see what they're doing as waking up the world to the danger of a totally anti-democratic, anti-free speech, gaslighting, genocidal maniacs in China. And I think they woke up a lot of the world. And then, of course, I fly to Taiwan, which is this country that the U.S. kind of not only turned their back on when we decided to have relations with the People's Republic, but we turned our back by letting them have 4 decades of totalitarian martial law, of disappearances and torture. And so here is this island country that has been, the Portuguese take over, the Dutch, the Chinese, the Japanese. But here's this island that's several times when they had a breath, declared their independence. And now they have people who went through 4 decades of martial law and fascism and found a way to overcome it and have flowered into this democracy with human rights. The only country in Asia in which gay marriage is legal. Not the voters voted it down, kind of the same scenarios in the U.S. But the court said, "Oh, no, we have equal rights. You can't do it. They have to be able to have that same right." And so it's just a wonderful story of, I think the best story of the last 50 years of a country moving from vicious, evil government to a wonderful, democratic, free society. Not perfect, let's not be silly, but just what a change. And I've just become, I remember flying out of Taipei and saying to myself, I've got to add Taiwan to my list of things to do, that I want to keep America free. I have this thing where I want to sit on my deathbed. I don't really ever want to sit on my deathbed, but if someone forces me to sit on that damn bed, then I want to have certain things going through my head. And one of them is that my kids are alive and healthy and free. My wife is still there, alive, healthy, and free. And that America is. Well, I've added Taiwan to that. Just because I've been so moved by what their people have done to build their own free society. And in the course of doing that, I've begun to think much more about how free people around the world combine, get together, work together to keep ourselves free. Because it's not good enough for our governments to be busy doing that, because I don't trust them. I don't believe they are doing that. So I don't look at it as the US government versus Chinese government. I look at it as us, we free people, versus totalitarianism, which is ensconced in Beijing, the butchers of Beijing, and unfortunately is making great gains in Washington, D.C. And so I see it much more as the people have to have some power, some levers, and we have to work across national lines as well as within our nations.
You let one ant stand up to us, then they all might stand up. Those puny little ants outnumber us 100 to 1. And if they ever figure that out, there goes our way of life. It's not about food. It's about keeping those ants in line.
You mentioned this issue that was not really U.S. versus China. It's the people versus out of control government.
I think China, because it's kind of everything you would think America was against. They don't like democracy. They've got 90 million people making all the decisions for 1.4 billion people. So it's like this, aristocracy, except it's really not, it's not broad enough to even be an aristocracy. It's not its own class. It's this little junta at the top. And of course there's when Mike Bloomberg was hit on saying, nice things about Xi, he said, look, he's not a dictator. He's one of 25 on the Politburo, 25 people making decisions for 1.4 billion. And of course, I suspect if some of those other 25 say the wrong thing, then Xi will have them arrested for something or other that they did wrong. And that is a frightening prospect to see China gaining so much power. And look, they're going to be an economic powerhouse any way you slice it, because they have a smart population, a talented population. They've got a lot of people, so they're a big market. They've got some real advantages, and that's great. We want countries to be prosperous, but the idea of the world order, so to speak, just welcoming China to the top is insane. And of course, once you come to that conclusion, you might also come to the conclusion that the world order is pretty much insane. I've actually come to a point where I think the best path for the United States of America from a foreign policy standpoint is to begin to build a coalition of free nations that work together and have an alliance. And those nations would include nations like Taiwan, and they would include Europe and others, but looking for it to be much more of a joint group effort and not the US as lone policeman of every continent and all the oceans. And so I'm hopeful that, there are ways to get to a better place throughout the world without the US being, superpower every day, every second to everyone everywhere. But I do think that that how the U.S. strategically moves ahead and away from a world policeman role is pretty darn important for millions of people around the world.
Well, it would certainly be less of a target for everybody if we're not on top and trying to make ourselves on top all the time in every way. I want to talk a little bit about this connection between the influence of China, and this also be broadened into the idea of the influence of big business and global business in general, that there seems to be, and South Park famously ridiculed all the NBA players and the executives going over to kiss the ring of President Xi and the Communist Party there. It does seem like more and more our media, which is corporate owned mostly, our media and our businesses are going to be under the influence of the weight of Chinese power. And I think that we should be very aware that that is going on.
Yes, we should be aware that they are right now putting the thumb screws in to stop people from saying anything anti-China and using that economic leverage in every way they can. We constantly in the U.S. and Australia is going through it much more so, but we're constantly finding out that, they had the police deputy commissioner, whoever in New York City on the take for the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. They have all these professors who didn't report this money they're getting from China or this money. And they're looking for all kinds of secrets and other things. There's kind of a quasi Cold War going on, and I think there's a tendency to say, well, we don't want war, we don't want a Cold War. Well, you can stick your head in the sand, but the biggest problem we have is that our own government too much wants to be like China, and our problem is not recognizing what's going on. And that's got to change. And so every time somebody calls it out, it helps. I don't have all the answers what you do, but I think what your question, Kevin, really points up the fact that we know if the public is quiet, if we don't say anything about getting clothes manufactured by people who are in concentration camps, and we're willing to accept that and get the 47-cent savings, there are going to be businesses who go and do that all day long. And in fact, if some of us reject it, they're going to do it for other customers who don't reject it. Business and government and our State Department, our political leaders, I guarantee you the people whispering in their ear the most about China are whispering for how can I get in on the game? I want to be rich too. I want to sell to 1.4 billion customers. And so if we as a public are not awake, aware, in the game, then we're going to have the same thing we've had since Tiananmen Square in 1989, which is let's look the other way and let's make as much money as we can on China. And, our grandkids will live in a world in which you better not say anything that the Chinese don't want because they've got their hooks into everybody. Or you better not say anything, not only that the Chinese don't want, but your own government just shut down your internet access because you said something they didn't like, or you're part of some group that they consider to be, white supremacist or black racial activist or whatever. We don't want a society in which our debate, our opportunity to speak out is being stopped, even if it's not by the government, but by a system that's been created in which all kinds of really evil people have a lot of power.
This issue of, the people who are in the government, maybe in our own government, don't necessarily want us to be free. Now, I would say this. I don't think the people at the National Security Agency are, by and large, our enemy. I think, by and large, they're red-blooded Americans just like the three of us. I do think, though, that any time you have an unaccountable power, it is prone to be misused, and particularly that they say, the worst rise to the top. People who want to misuse power will be drawn to the source of that power, and they will get control over it. Now, I'm not saying that the corruption exists at this level, but it's the kind of thing that, if such a corrupt person was able to gain such power over military intelligence and all the kind of ways they can see, total information dominance is the policy basically. Yes, then we would lose our freedom like that.
Well, and I suspect that they're still scooping up all kinds of information that the federal court has said they can't, because I just don't know who's there to stop them. Who knows everything's secret? It's the problem with secret courts and secret agencies. Yeah. You don't know what they're doing. But I do think that they will continue to scoop up this information until we more aggressively stop them. And it does lead us to a society in which people, don't have any basic privacy and are afraid to say what they think. And, we've grown up in America in which, if people were erring, they were erring on the side of saying too much, mouthing off anytime they felt like it. I want to live in that society the rest of my life. I'd rather people mouth off too much than be silent. And, I think about, and I don't know why this popped in my head, but we talked about China and the US and so on. The movie One Child Nation, which is about the Chinese policy of you can only have one child, and if you have a second, we might kill it in front of you. And the fact that it never got much pushback from the US because we were all in our own heads on the abortion issue. Somehow the forced killing of children, we couldn't differentiate. But anyway, in that movie, in that documentary, a number of people from China are talking about it after the fact. And the way they talk about it, that there's nothing we could do. It's what we had to do. It's the way things were. It's what could anyone do? What could we say? Yeah. That's not how we react to these things in America. But you can see the path to get to an America where we shut up and don't say what we ought to say. And so, I think I've always been kind of a pathological optimist. I'm more pessimistic today because of what I see happening in China and because of what I see happening in the United States that goes along that same path. We have all kinds of opportunity to change the criminal justice system. And instead, it's almost like we want to have a cultural revolution instead. And use race to separate people and kind of we're gonna make this person that you're the problem. No, you're the problem. We have, I think, I'm very optimistic about what can be done by people working in politics, largely because I see the initiative process and most people just see candidates. We could elect this guy or elect that guy. Well, I'd be more pessimistic if all I thought we could do is elect the next set of guys or gals. But I do think there's things we can do. If we don't do them, if we become spectators, then the world is sliding to the Chinese model. We're going to have social scores. everything's going to be on our phone. We're going to get the vaccine when we're told to. We're going to do this when we're told to. And I'm not a big anti-vax or anything. I'm just saying that there's a choice as to what world we want to end up in. And we are moving from a world where people speak out in America to a world in which not so much. And that's the wrong direction.
My biggest problem right now is this acceptance by many people, apparently, of censorship. And, you know, there's arguments back and forth about whether or not these huge, gigantic companies, big tech, let's call them all, you know, lump them all in that big tech classification. Is it just that they're shutting people up, even though they're a so-called private company? I mean, you'll hear libertarians are, well, it's a private company. Well, it's not really a private company. If somebody comes along and steals or hijacks the public square, and that's what's happened, they've hijacked the public square from my perception, and the public square, as we've been used to using now for 10 or 15 years, however long it's been years, now suddenly we're being shut out of that public square, and people are becoming very angry about it. So, we're seeing it in all sorts of levels, and it's just growing. And all that's going to do, I heard Dennis Prager talk over the past couple of months about this, and how, he kind of likened them to the metaphor of a pressure cooker. When you have people all battling ideas, there's this steam release on a pressure cooker. Well, effectively, what these big tech companies are doing is they're sealing up that ability for people to release their steam. And, well, what's going to happen out of that? No good can come of that.
No, it's still a huge problem. And I think some of these other social media companies will grow a little bit and maybe provide some competition. But the problem I have with it is, let's say it was all private and they don't like this opinion or that opinion, and they say it plainly. And so there you have it. It would still be bad because it would mean less robust debate.
Exactly.
It might not be a censorship or a crime that you can take them to court on, but it's not a good development. It's a bad development. And it strikes me as strange that a lot of people I know on the left don't see that as a bad development at all. They see it as speech being cleaned up, and that's scary. The other thing is, if this is all private, then Facebook execs and Twitter execs have not been called up to Capitol Hill to testify. And there's not little parts of our federal code that have been written in consultation with them and to protect them from certain liabilities. And we know there have. So we know just from a bully pulpit type standpoint, there has been political pressure put on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and so on. And we also know that, they've written this 230, section 230, as if if you're just a platform, you can't be held responsible. But it's turned on its head. It's these people policing their platforms. Well, once you start policing them, you ought to be held responsible. So there are some legal changes that I think need to be made. There's also, outside what I just mentioned, the fact that there's money changing hands. The US government does business with Apple, and they do business with Google. And I think that there's some serious problems with the way it's all set up. I don't have a wave this wand and it's all fixed, but I think if people aren't troubled by the cancel culture being practiced by big tech, then I don't know. I don't think they're very fond of free speech.
Okay, look, you don't want to end up like the spokesman for Subway, do you?
Did you just use a term that excludes women from an occupation?
Okay, let's back up.
Ah! Did you just say spokesman instead of spokesperson when women are just as capable of selling sandwiches as anyone? Are you purposefully trying to use words that assert your male privilege? Do you think Italian Americans and women are less important?
Oh, God!
You dare to use words that alienate two communities of people who have to deal with verbal biases like yours on a daily basis?
So, Paul, thank you so much for joining us today on our Individual Thoughts episode. And I want to say that, again, I think that if people knew all the things you've done over the course of your career, they would be pretty blown away by the risk you've taken and the knowledge that you've acquired in protecting our rights and fighting through democratic means against a government that's out of control a lot of times.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. And sometimes I think if people only knew how out of control their government is, the more you engage with it, the more you get these little moments of clarity. And sometimes they're very frightening. But you also get moments where you realize the public does not want that. Americans are much more together on what we want from government, which is peace and less strong arm tactics than I think we're portrayed to be.
Hey, I think that was a great interview we had with Paul Jacob just now. Now, this last thing he said about who Americans really are, that they really just want to have peace and justice and basic decency and respect. And he didn't say all those things, but I think those are things that people would like to believe about Americans. And I think you have something to say about that.
I think he's hitting the nail on the head for the silent majority. I think the problem is that both the mainstream media and social media bring all those who really aren't necessarily seeking peace to the forefront and put them in the spotlight. And that's a lot of the problem, is that the people that actually do want to just live peacefully and live and let live are not spotlighted at all. Again, I feel like we're the silent majority. We just want to live and let live. I don't want to be told by other people what pronoun I want to use for them and all this stuff. It's like, hey, if you don't like the way I talk or the way I associate with you, then why should I bother at all? I'm not forcing my opinions and my views on anyone else. Why should I feel like I have to be forced to agree with this, what I see is a very vocal and loud minority? Now, the sad thing about that is, in my view, that vocal, loud minority is increasing, and it seems like the norm is becoming that we have to abide by whatever society decides.
And what is society, of course?
Well, what is society but just people?
Right.
I mean, I agree with the whole lack of representation. That's why I originally joined the Libertarian Party and tried to get involved there, because I was looking for some way in which we could actually have representation for people that actually have a concept of what I believe what liberty is and what liberty isn't. And the way I see that is what liberty isn't and hasn't been for over 100 years is the constant infringement, violation, and usurpation of our natural rights. And this has been a growing situation for over 100 years, and I don't see any semblance whatsoever of it changing, of it going back to a concept where, no, we need to really start looking at what are natural rights? What is the government supposed to be doing? What are the boundaries of the government's jurisdiction? These types of things. And what I keep hearing from the mainstream is the antithesis of what I believe the proper role of government is supposed to be. And this is something I don't see turning around, and that's why I've made a decision now at this point in time, starting in 2021, that I don't think I'll be voting ever again in my life. I think I'm done. I'm just totally done. And it's sad when someone like me, that for over 20 years now have been devoting an entire, a lot of my time and energy into learning about all of these things that we discuss and trying to figure out, well, let's try to make things better. Let's try to root out the corruption and reform the system. Not that it was ever perfect, but at least try to get back to a road that leads not to total economic and societal destruction, but that leads to the maximization of peace, prosperity, and liberty. And unless people, though, are actually longing to seek the truth that has to be sought out to come to the conclusions of what we actually need to do to change it to get to that point, I don't see it changing at all.
I definitely hear you when you say that if people are not passionate, if they are not in love with the idea of pursuing the truth, in the same sense that people love Jesus or love God or love their favorite person in the world, we will lose everything, because truth is that clarifying agent, that light. Even if we're not talking about an issue of good or bad, if we're talking about something that will work or will not work, and to have clarity that we can have the instruments of the human mind and using discourse to communicate those ideas to each other and to help each other figure out where each of us is wrong in our own point of view. And what you said before about these loud, nasty voices that are out there trying to prevent people from having discussions, those people are the enemy of liberty. They are the enemy of freedom and democracy and justice and decency, because they're saying you're not allowed to have a different point of view. You have to say what we say. You have to repeat the propaganda back. It's like, a memorization test. That's not freedom.
Largely, a lot of these people don't even realize that what they're advocating is the antithesis to peace, prosperity, and liberty. They're just not aware they've been indoctrinated into a collectivist system that says otherwise. Disregard the individual thinking, disregard individual philosophy or individualism, disregard any unique thinker that is opposing the mainstream, the norm. Disregard all that, just cancel all that and shut them up and censor all that. That is not the path to maximizing peace, prosperity, and liberty. That is the path to maximizing turmoil, poverty, and tyranny, quite
Absolutely.
frankly. And this is the path we're on. And I'm sorry to say that I no longer want to be part of changing that, because I believe, again, it's a personal decision. I've decided I think we're too far gone. So I'm back to the idea of survival. I just want to set the rest of my life up to where I could try to survive what's coming and survive the tyranny, so that when what I would call Nazi thugs, the law enforcement officers that will go along with things like red flag laws or forced vaccination, when they come knocking at someone's door at 5 o'clock in the morning, it won't be mine. And I'm sorry to say that. I hate the fact that it will be somebody's, but I don't want it to be mine. And I have to focus now on what I have to do to preserve my life and survive through the coming storm, basically. That's where I'm at.
Well, I think every person in their lives has to determine what's best for them personally. And politics and being involved in politics, even in this, from a policy perspective, or even just following the news, can be very wearying. And it takes time away and energy away from running your own personal affairs and protecting yourself. And clearly, I know I've gotten death threats in the past, and you piss people off and they might come looking for you.
That's right.
And I've accepted that as a risk of what I do, as my calling in this world. But I would never tell anybody that they are required to go and face this storm in the way I do. And the way people like Paul Jacob, we didn't get into it in that much detail, but he literally was threatened with 10 years in prison for doing something that was not wrong at all. He was actually given advice to go and, he could go run these petition drives in Oklahoma, and they didn't like the petition. It was a threat to their power. So they created these trumped up charges, which thankfully the federal court was wise enough to say, this is bogus, it's over with. But he was personally threatened with 10 years in prison for trying to do the right thing to help the people of Oklahoma.
Well, he was fortunate that he had somebody in that federal court that was wise enough. But as we keep moving forward, people keep getting put into positions of power that are obviously, to me, not wise enough to make a righteous or just decision in that case. And now Paul, he would have been stuck in a state prison for how long? 10 years, maybe even, or maybe less. But the point is for doing nothing wrong. What about the gentleman who is in California, who's a journalist that got undercover video of Planned Parenthood people talking about whatever. He didn't break any laws, but now he's facing prison term for what? Just because Kamala Harris made a very, very bad decision and decided for whatever reason, she pressed the matter. And now we have someone that has as little wisdom as her that's now the vice president, and chances are might become the president.
Very likely.
Yeah, very likely. So the point is that here we go. We have somebody who has no wisdom at all, poised to be in command of a military of the largest superpower on the planet, who just made that horrible decision there. I see this continual mode of corruption growing, eating the nation from within, and that corruption rotting and rotting and rotting to the point where I feel we are now, to where there is no hope in mankind anywhere, in humankind, to fix this problem. I had pretty much little to no faith in the integrity in the election system before 2020. The entire election process, from the voting system to every facet of it, I had little to no faith in the integrity in it before 2020. Now I have even less, if that's possible. So what I've been saying lately is what I believe that now our best weapon of defense is going to be civil disobedience in a large scale, when the powers that be go to enact all of these extra egregious natural rights violations. And as this becomes more of an aggressive situation, I think our biggest tool is going to be civil disobedience at this point.
I think these are things that we're going to end up having to talk about one way or the other, whether it's on this show or in bars and pubs and private dining rooms around the country,
or from behind bars,
or well, you can talk to your cellmate.
Yeah.
You could convert your cellmate into being a libertarian. Prisons are terrible, but hey, there's so much more to talk about all this stuff. The cover story, we're going to go more into all the clips that we've used here, and all the clips we've used are very interesting, including the crazy Teletubbies intro that we put on there, and how creepy and weird that was. How creepy and weird that was. Let's wrap this episode up with some good music.
That sounds like a plan.
No, you could. So